You are not here by accident. We are standing at the edge of possibilities between what is, what could, and what will be. Where time, space, and humanity cross paths. Where the future has stopped being theory as old assumptions fade away and new realities are becoming real. Are you ready to step beyond the familiar? Look no further and enter the third horizon.
Before we begin, let us pause for a moment and consider a simple reality. Modern civilization depends on systems: medical, energy, transportation, communication, government, health, and scientific systems. Most of us rely on these systems every day, but very few people ever see what happens when those systems come under real pressure. In our previous episode, we explored something called the complexity gap, the growing distance between complexity of modern systems and our ability to understand them. History shows us what happens when that gap becomes too large. Systems fail. Institutions fracture. Civilizations struggle to adapt. But collapse is not the only outcome. Some societies develop something far more powerful: integration capacity, the ability to coordinate knowledge, institutions, and people when systems are under stress. Tonight, we explore how that capacity works. And to help us explore, we are joined by someone who studies complex systems from a unique perspective. Dr. Sarah Clark holds a PhD in natural medicine and a doctorate in functional medicine, specializing in how complex biological systems respond to stress, imbalance, and recovery. Sarah, welcome to the Third Horizon.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here.
Well, it is certainly an honor to have you here, and I want to thank you for joining us tonight.
Of course.
So tonight, we explore a deeper question. What allows complex systems to survive pressure instead of collapsing? With that in mind, let us begin. Civilizations grow by solving problems. Agriculture solved the problem of food stability. Trade networks solved the problem of resource distribution. Infrastructure solved the problem of distance. But every solution adds new layers of complexity. Anthropologist Joseph Taylor studied this pattern in his famous work, The Collapse of Complex Societies. He argued that societies solve problems by adding complexity: new institutions, new technologies, new regulations, new infrastructure. At first, these solutions produce enormous benefits. But over time, something changes. Each new layer produces smaller returns. Eventually, systems become expensive, too expensive to maintain. And many pressures arrive. And when they arrive, they begin to fail. Sarah, from your perspective, as systems get more complex and we add more complexity to those systems, how might we ensure those systems do not fail because of the complexity that we added?
That is a genuinely good question, and one that I think a lot of people face when it comes to health and wellness, because we think we need to add things for it to be better. We long time ago, like 1913, 1915, I think my grandmother would tell me stories of adding electricity to a house. And granted, burning oil for light, burning candles was not ideal, but you add electricity and then there's, the added upkeep. There's always extra things you have to do when you add to a system. Now let's take the human body, for instance. Um, back to like 1913, right? We were eating foods that we could pronounce. We were eating seasonally. We were eating things that were natural to the environment that we'd grown up in. And as we've added new medicines or new foods or even genetically modified foods, just the system can't always keep up or can't always adapt as quickly as we need to. Let's take, say, strawberries, right, out of season. You used to be able, ate them in late spring and early summer, and now all of a sudden you have strawberries from all around the world being shipped in, and sometimes you have allergies or food sensitivities to those. It could be because of fertilizer, they're genetically modified, they're grown under different circumstances. And then instead of just removing that layer, right, the strawberries, all of a sudden we're taking, a medicine because our stomach is upset, or, we're taking an antihistamine because all of a sudden we're having an allergic reaction. Complex systems aren't always the best system. Sometimes just keeping it simple and removing those things that are not needed, or those instances that don't really have a strong value add are the simplest way to solve the challenge.
No, that was a very good point. Yeah, sometimes you just need to get less complex, and that really makes a lot of sense. History also shows something important. Some societies learn how to design systems capable of surviving complexity. One of the most remarkable examples comes from the Netherlands. Much of the country lies below sea level. For centuries, the Dutch faced a constant threat from the ocean. Instead of reacting to disasters, they built institutions designed specifically to manage water over generations. Regional water authorities, engineering standards, long-term planning. These institutions eventually produced one of the largest flood protection systems ever built, called the Delta Works. The lesson is simple. Surviving complexity requires institutions that think in generations and not election cycles. Sarah, in functional medicine, there's often a focus on long-term system balance rather than reacting to symptoms after they appear. In the automotive field, where I worked as a technician, we would call that being proactive instead of reactive. So, do you believe this proactive approach is better than reactive approaches? And which one do you believe is more costly for the long term?
I absolutely do. I think we actually call it preventative medicine or preventative health. And I think any step that you could take to ensure wellness instead of reactively addressing like illness or disease is always the most cost effective and actually in the long term the easiest way to handle any sort of illness that should befall the body or any sort of imbalance. It's just growing up, I always always took my Flintstone vitamin. I know that's old school, but right? Like I took my Flintstone vitamin because, it's supposed to keep you healthy and make sure you have the vitamins and minerals that you need. And now in some cases, because of like over farming or perhaps just the way that food is developed or grown, it doesn't necessarily have all of the vitamins and nutrients it did in the 70s and 80s when I'm a child. And instead of addressing the bigger issue, right, that like our food might not be as nutritious as it is, people are either justifying eating more food, which is definitely not the answer, or, in some cases you need to supplement with vitamins and minerals just to make sure you're getting all of the nutrients that you need. But in any case, if you can keep a system running, whether it's your car or, your air conditioning or your, your water remittance site in systems in the Netherlands. If you can keep something running and if it is maintained and treated well, it's always easier and more cost effective and just simpler in the long run to keep it running and to keep it running well than it is to fix it if it breaks down.
Absolutely. Yes. And, a lot of that, what you were saying, reminds me of a lot of what Robert Kennedy says, because he's a very proponent of wellness more than trying to fix it after it's broke, but keep it fixed while maintained properly is better than trying to fix after it's broke. Yeah. And I agree with that philosophy. History also gives us examples of what happens when integration capacity breaks down. One of the most painful examples occurred in the United States in 2005. Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast and overwhelmed the levee system protecting the city of New Orleans. The storm itself was powerful, but the catastrophe that followed was not caused by wind alone. The levee system failed in multiple locations. Floodwaters poured into large sections of the city. Hospitals became isolated. Emergency response systems struggled to coordinate. Thousands of people were left without immediate assistance. The disaster exposed something deeper. The challenge was not simply the storm, it was the complexity of the systems responsible for responding to it. Multiple agencies, multiple jurisdictions, multiple infrastructure systems. When the pressure arrived, integration failed. Sarah, when complex systems become overwhelmed, whether in the body or in broader systems like what I described, what do you think determines whether they will adapt or begin to break down?
That is a genuinely good question that I've never considered, whether they adapt or break down. I am of two minds of this. First of all, I would consider the elements that are being added. And the second part of that answer, I guess, would be how quickly the environment is having to adapt to those. Say you move to a new location in the United States or whether you move abroad. And as you grow up, you become very sensitized to say like grasses and trees and like pollens or, any of those seasonal allergies that sadly most of us here in the United States suffer from. But most of the time you kind of get used to them, right? Like, you're used to the flowers, you may sneeze a couple times, but actually moving to a new location, I not so recently moved to Texas, but for those first 2 or 3 years, I suffered tremendously from cedar pollen. And I don't know, some grass that we did not have in Virginia that we definitely had in Texas. And it overwhelmed my system and I was constantly having like cold and allergies. And those are very large biological agents, right? That the body is going to react to. And I was forced to adapt very quickly. In the case of, say, evolution, right? There's ways that the body can adapt from generation to generation. I mean, going all the way back to blue eyes or, light blonde hair so that you can better adapt to UV rays even now, those who would argue that, children's brains are changing and adapting because of the use of electronic devices. And even, kids as young as kindergarten whose attention span has now been shortened because they, only watch 3-minute clips on whether it's like, it's TikTok or YouTube. So, some adaptation is good. Some adaptations are not so good. But again, I think it would be just the type of adaptation the system would have to undertake and the speed at which it's forced to take it. I think there's some systems that absolutely can adapt. It's just most, if overwhelmed, are going to fail.
So the ones that adapt are probably more flexible than the ones that are rigid.
Absolutely.
I would also think of preparation because a lot of what you're describing there sounds like preparation, having you being studying the human system, you know as well as I do that there are many things because okay, I'm allergic or was allergic to just about everything that was in Georgia, and dust mites, and chicken feathers, and dog dander. I mean, I had what they called a grand mal allergy attack, and was literally covered in 90% of my body in hives. But I knew that I did not want to live that way. So I studied it to see what I could do to stop that because I knew, you know me, I'm a problem solver. I solve problems, and I figured I could solve that one too. And so I found out that if I go get allergy shots, and even though they were painful and I had to take them for 5 years, I would no longer be allergic to what I was allergic to. And I did, and it worked. You know, that to me is like preparation. It was painful at the time that I did it, but it saved me a lot of misery and pain later on down the road. Yeah.
Allergy shots are amazing. They are amazing. It's like
Yeah.
Western,
Oh, I agree. I'm right there. I know because they cured my allergies.
even though like, since allergy shots are not always, desirable because they can be kind of painful, even just, like if you know that, there's going to be cedar pollen, right? Like I start taking allergy medicine a week before I even see the first hint of yellow on my car. And and I take it all the way through, as a means of prevention so that my system isn't overloaded. No, it's an amazing example of preparation. So well done.
Complex systems do not always fail slowly. Sometimes a single event exposes weaknesses that have existed for years. In February of 2021, extreme winter storm struck Texas. Temperatures dropped far below normal across the state. The electrical grid began to fail. Power plants shut down. Natural gas pipelines froze. Electricity demand surged. Water systems began to fail. Within hours, millions of people had lost power. Hospitals struggled to maintain operations. What looked at first like a weather crisis quickly revealed something deeper. The infrastructure had not been designed for that level of stress. And once several systems failed simultaneously, the entire network began to cascade. Sarah, when one system begins to fail and start affecting others, what are the warning signs that a system is approaching a tipping point? And I would add that you probably know what I'm talking about when it comes to Texas because you live there.
I did. We had not lived there long. I was born and raised in Ohio. And so we know that the electricity can sometimes does go out, but I was never expecting it to be out for as long as it was. And we did. We kind of watched in horror as they said, oh, like, the water pipes are freezing. You're going to need to ration power. And they're like, oh, the lines are frozen and the generators are frozen and we're going to be out for days and days and days. And it was catastrophic. So in that case, I don't think the general public in that instance, we had absolutely no expectation that that electric grid was going to fail. And in that sense, I'm sure and I am coming to my answer, I promise. But the US, I think, is divided into 3 power grids. Like, there's the east of the Mississippi, there's west of the Mississippi, and then there's Texas, and we're all on our own. And in the other two power grids, I believe, I could be wrong about this, but I believe they have the ability to share power. If there's a extreme pull, say in Colorado, I don't know, electricity can, cross the divide and they can kind of like act as a subsidiary, a power source for them. But Texas, we are all on our own. And I think in this case, there's always the fear that it would fail, mostly in the summer, when it's 100 plus degrees. And that's, when we expect there to be strain, but it typically doesn't get that cold for that long. And I think there's always indications, right? Again, like, in the summer, we would have, mild brownouts, or they would tell us, we're to like 90% capacity. And again, it goes back to the maintenance question. Like, had Texas in any way in like the decade before actually upgraded the system, or made sure that they properly maintained the system, or even just took into account the massive growth that Texas has gone through, just to make sure that the systems could accommodate, all the new taxpayers and all the new all the new houses that required electricity. So there was that, that foresight and that planning that we were talking about earlier. There's that preventative aspect that we've also touched about in a previous question, just making sure that the system is, healthy and is able to just meet the need. And then finally, just, the foresight. You also asked about that, and you've touched on that, just having the foresight to know that, there is, with the growth comes more strain. I don't think that Texas handled it particularly well. I know that hospitals were suffering. I know there was untold amounts of damage to houses as pipes broke, and even to pools. We hadn't lived in an area with a pool before, and as we got the notice that electrical systems were failing, all of a sudden all this water was like rushing through our neighborhood. Come to find out that very intelligent pool owners knew that they had to drop the levels of their pool below the pump so that the pump didn't explode. So going back to preparation, they knew. So I always think there's telltale signs if a system is going to fail. In the human body, it's symptoms, some symptoms that we just, brush off as, oh, I have a headache, or, oh, my lower back hurts because I'm working too hard, when it could be your kidneys. Just listening, if you listen to a system, I think it's always going to tell you that something is amiss, and that it needs, it needs support, or that it needs attention. And yeah,
Kinda like
and
you
just
talk
that.
about intuition. Yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
and I agree with that, because there's always that little voice that says, "Hey, you need to be doing this." And, I'm not one of those kind of people that ignores that voice. I actually pay attention to it, and it has served me well over the years. But yeah, okay, great. Hurricane Katrina also revealed something many people had never considered. Modern hospitals are among the most complex systems in modern civilization. At Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans, floodwaters surrounded the hospital. Electricity failed. Generators malfunctioned. Elevators stopped. Ventilators became unreliable. Doctors and nurses suddenly found themselves operating in conditions few medical professionals ever expect to face. Patients had to be evacuated by helicopter, one at a time, and staff had to decide who should go first. These were not theoretical decisions. They were life and death decisions made in real time. Sarah, when multiple systems are under stress at once, what makes the difference between a system that adapts and one that becomes overwhelmed?
I would say it's how you address the repair of the systems. So say, for just for sake of example, someone's having, we're going to say, fatty liver, right? They're having circulation problems in their legs, but their heart stops, right? It doesn't matter if you fix the liver, right? And it doesn't matter if you clear the leg, because if the heart stops beating, then you're gonna have bigger problems. So I think it's just it's addressing the needs of the body in priority of systems. If the brain's not functioning, if the heart's not functioning, if the lungs not functioning, the body is not going to function. But in that case also, addressing those items that are an easier fix, maybe even not necessarily simultaneous too, but, running alongside the repair of the bigger systems might be a course of action that a medical professional would consider. But you have to make sure that those, the largest systems that are absolutely required for life are maintained. And then, kind of, if you can fix the engine and the engine is running, right, and you can get gas in the car and the car is going to start, then you can take care of the broken windshield, and you can take care of the, the flat tire, and, the chassis that's not running as it should, but, the car's got to run. So same thing with the body.
It sounds like you're talking about priorities.
Yes,
You got to manage your priorities, and
I do.
I can definitely agree with that. And that's basically being systematic. But I like the point you made about not ignoring the small stuff too, because the small stuff can come back and bite you if you ignore it. Yeah.
The
We actually had a process we called jerry rigging and a mechanic, and we would have a system go down and we could do a quick fix, what are called quick fix or a jerry rig, and it would get the system up enough to get it off the battlefield or get it to a support site. But the one thing that we made sure is that we did not rely on that quick fix as a permanent fix. Yeah.
yes
And yeah,
I think that's where the adage, put a band-aid on a bullet wound. It'll for a very short time it might be helpful, but I think you also hit on something, right? Like, you have to listen to those small symptoms. If there's a knocking in the engine, you may be able to to get it off the battlefield, but you've heard that knocking for a while, so at some point it does need to be addressed.
absolutely. Yes. Sometimes the most powerful systems emerge from difficult lessons. During the Vietnam War, military doctors began observing patterns in trauma survival. Helicopter evacuation allowed wounded soldiers to reach surgical teams faster than in previous wars. Medics stabilized patients in the field. Surgeons were ready upon arrival. For the first time in history, large numbers of severely injured soldiers survived injuries that once would have been fatal. But when physicians studied trauma care back home in the United States, they discovered something troubling. Civilian emergency systems were often less coordinated than battlefield medicine. So doctors redesigned the system. Level 1 trauma centers, coordinated ambulance systems, rapid triage protocols, emergency helicopter transport. Modern trauma systems were born, and survival rates improved dramatically. It was one of the clearest examples of a complex system learning from experience. Sarah, modern trauma medicine grew directly out of lessons learned in extreme environments. From your perspective, how important is it for complex systems to learn from past crises and continuously evolve?
I think it's brilliant. I think it's paramount. If we are going to learn anything in any sort of complex system, I mean, the example that you gave is perfect. And I'll take that one step further. So yes, the trauma example you gave is spot on. And then if you are looking at, similar trauma, say like organ replacements or like an organ transplant, right? There's a very, very finite amount of time that you have from, the moment that organ has been removed from the person that is donating it until it needs to get into the recipient. And so many times organs have been lost because they couldn't get it there on time, or, the person couldn't be transported in time, or there was a failure somewhere in the process. And sadly, in all of those failings came, new systems. There's literally, I've been reading about, systems that I'm not going to say it's a drone, but, they put it in a transport system that goes up into the air and it flies across the city. There's basically bypass machines that you can put an organ on so that blood is pumping and oxygen is still getting to the organ so that it can be transferred, to the transplant recipient across the country. So I think with innovation and with really understanding the system and the needs of the systems, I think innovation is incredible. And the earlier case, sadly, it took learning from such a very, very devastating war to make those changes. But I believe all hospitals probably across the world have learned from those trauma services, and now, more people than ever are being saved because of what they've learned. So I think if someone is willing to learn and be innovative and think outside of the box and use past failings for future success, then I think it's pretty amazing.
Yes, absolutely. And so do I. I mean, I think we all need a little humbling in that area sometimes. A lot of us don't want to admit our mistakes, but when we do, it helps us grow even better the next time around. So, yeah, I agree with that. Emergency medicine offers another powerful example of integration capacity. Trauma medicine, there is a concept known as the golden hour. The first hour after severe injury is often the most critical window for survival. Bleeding must be controlled. Airways must be secured. Shock treated. And the patient must reach definitive care quickly. The phrase was popularized by trauma surgeon Dr. R. Adams Crawley, who helped pioneer modern trauma systems. His insight was simple but profound. Survival does not depend on a single intervention. It depends on the entire system working together. Ambulances, emergency departments, surgical teams, blood banks, transportation networks. If those systems integrate effectively, patients survive injuries that once would have been fatal. But if coordination fails, the window closes. Sarah, can you relate to the golden hour from your work with human systems? And do you see similar critical windows in other systems we depend on where fast coordination determines whether the system holds or breaks?
Yes and no. So, just to clarify, as you said, I do have two PhDs. I am not an MD. So, thankfully, I have never had a patient on the table in front of me where I've had to, be responsible for those moments ticking away on that golden hour. On the flip side of that, I have dealt, in functional medicine and holistic health, which of course takes into account the entire person and how those systems interact together and how important they can be. And I don't have an example from my practice, but I do have an example with the health of my mom. And she was having a health crisis, and like not knowing that the crisis was occurring, and then determining obviously that something was going terribly wrong and going terribly wrong very quickly. It became apparent not only that immediate need to determine what was going on, but to get help. We were probably 50 minutes to an hour away from the hospital she needed to be at. I had no way to transport her, so I had to, rely on innovation. And there were just all of those factors did hit all at once. And sadly, I was unprepared. I will admit, I was unprepared. The outcome, it turned out okay, but it can be touch and go. It goes back to just the ability to be alert and to pay attention. In the example that I gave, I lost my sense of like smell and taste during COVID. And so I didn't know, I didn't know that something was wrong because I did not have all my faculties. But it's just so important in any sort of, in any sort of emergency instance, just really to pay attention and to take into account, just like, the holistic person, hear, smell, see, touch. You don't taste people, obviously, but just being able to assess the entire system. You have to be aware. And I have such respect for medical personnel. This is what they do day in and day out. And they save, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives every year because of the training that they have and the preparedness that they have. So
Yeah, but
it's pretty
I
impressive.
mean, your well, like holistic medicine is the same way in a sense because I also am a proponent of holistic medicine, and I take supplements. And I studied the supplements in detail to find out which one does what how it helps this function of the body, that function of the body. And this is so that I can hold off effects that might be hitting my system at the age that I am. For instance, at my age, one of the worries is prostate cancer or prostate troubles. And so I take a holistic supplement to substitute what normally wouldn't be functioning in my body as well as it could, to make it function that well again. And I'm gonna have to say it works, at least in me. And and all the things that I take, for the reasons I take them, it seems to work really well. So I think in that, the golden hour would be, for me, would be in that situation, is just figuring out how those things work together, and how those systems in holistic medicine work together, and how to properly distribute them in your body without hurting yourself. But and I know it's not an hour, but still, that's what comes to mind for me. And it's time for a break. And now a word for our sponsors.
This episode of The Third Horizon is brought to you by Coin Toss Coffee, a brand built on passion, family, and the bold leap into possibility. Every blend is handcrafted from Kevin's own recipes, including their best-selling Cowboy Roast, bold, smooth, and unforgettable. And right now, listeners of The Third Horizon can enjoy 10% off their order at cointosscoffee.com using promo code Horizon10. That is cointosscoffee.com. Coin Toss Coffee. Take a chance on a better cup.
Engineers who design complex systems have learned something important. Failures rarely occur because a single component stops working. More often, failures happen at the points where systems connect. Inside NASA's systems engineering culture, there is a simple phrase that captures this lesson. It says, systems fail at the interfaces. In other words, the most dangerous part of any complex system is not always the technology itself. It is the interaction between systems. Communication breakdowns, coordination failures, human decision points. These are places where complexity becomes fragile. And if that fragility becomes too great, complexity integration fails. Sarah, in your professional experience with real-world systems, do you find that failures tend to arise more from a single source within a system, or are they more often the result of issues at the interfaces where different systems connect or interact?
That is a good question. When you were speaking about that, I was, thinking, looking at the space stuff in the background of your picture. I was thinking about how the astronauts got stuck on the International Space Station because they couldn't return on the ship that they'd planned because their spacesuits didn't interface with with the ship that was supposed to bring them back down. And I was like, yes,
That's a good example.
there's a perfect example of a breakdown out of an interface. Um, I think that the breakdown down of many systems, especially in health and wellness, is where that they come together. And that could be, that could be bone systems, that could be muscle systems, that could be needing to make sure you take your red rice yeast and CoQ10 to bring down your cholesterol, or even just eating well, so that your cholesterol comes down, and making sure you take your omega-3s so that your brain can function optimally. And there's always those pressure points, right? There's always those those rubs or those connections where something needs to be done to make sure that the system functions optimally. And I'm as guilty as I'm probably worse than most other patients because I'm supposed to take my vitamins, but I don't. Or, I'm supposed to um, take a magnesium bath after, I've run because I'm achy and I just don't take the time to do it. And there's a million different things that we could do to stay healthy, right? But we don't always do it. So I definitely don't think it's not one thing that we do. It's not one bad decision, not it's not one soda that you drink or, one meal where you indulge, but it's those small things over time, kind of like 1,000 little paper cuts, right? It's, not taking your medicine, not eating well, not trying to reduce sugar and high fructose corn syrup, and on and on and on, and just not getting sleep. Like really, probably now that I think about it, sleep is probably that the one biggest factor that's where there's that connection between your day and then that nighttime when your body needs to heal and rest. And I mean, how many times have we pushed off sleep or binge watched one more episode or one more chapter or answered one more email? It's all those little small decisions that lead up to bigger consequences. So I
Yeah,
definitely
I
think
mean, because everything you're describing there is, say the human body is the main system, and those are all connections of that. And so that definitely where interconnection is definitely interfering. But I think it works both ways. It can either interfere or it can add value. It depends on how it's managed. But yeah.
absolutely.
This is not only true in medicine or aerospace, it has always been true in civilization itself. The Roman road system was one of the great integration achievements of ancient world. Roads allowed law, trade, military movement, and administration to function across vast distances. Centuries later, the United States interstate highway system performed a similar role in the modern era. It connected regions, accelerated commerce, improved emergency mobility, and strengthened the nation's logistical backbone. These systems were not simply transportation projects, they were triumphs of integration capacity. They allowed societies to move people, resources, and information. Sarah, from a systems perspective, the human body has many comparable systems that transport vital information and resources to where they are needed. How critical are transportation and logistics systems for ensuring effective functionality, especially under stress?
Just quite honestly vital. If our brain is not functioning and the information isn't getting from our brains through our nervous systems, even to like just our peripheral nervous system, right? There's going to be a massive breakdown. The same thing holds true with digestion. The same, which is going to give us the energy, or the oxygenation of our blood through the inhalation, of air into our lungs, and then transporting all of that oxygen to all the different muscles in the body so that we can move and survive. And so there's just nothing comparable in the body, because if one system fails, all the systems are going to fail. But it's interesting under stress how some of those systems don't necessarily fail, but they adapt momentarily. It goes back to the fight or flight. Not going to get into evolutionary discussion, but they talk about I don't know, what is it, like the lizard brain or whatever it is, like just the that early
Survival
evolution.
instinct.
Yes, thank you. That early evolutionary just response of the body to go into fight or flight. And if it becomes stressed, blood moves away to the extremities so that you can move very quickly. Digestion slows down because your body doesn't need to be expending energy on digesting your food, right, when you need to run. And our senses become heightened, our blood pressure increases, so that you can move faster. And in most cases, these are really, really short lived. They do serve a purpose. They serve the purpose of saving one's life, or making it possible for them to survive a situation. Now, interestingly, much of the challenges, the health challenges that people are experiencing now is just a heightened or prolonged sense of being in that fight or flight, whether it be constant noise from traffic or, stress from the environment. It could be stress from a situation or a location, or even, back to the allergies we were talking about. If the body is always fighting that histamine response, the body is always in an agitated state. So, it's an interesting question. There's there's an int-
I believe in God, so I'll say God gave it to us, but is that our body likes to produce these really cool chemicals when we're under stress, adrenaline and all this other stuff that really can make us feel like super people when it's in that moment. But I think that human systems, if designed properly, do the exact same thing. All the systems we have, if they have those kind of things built into them so that they can adapt to a changing world. One of the most remarkable examples of integration capacity in modern history was the Apollo program. More than 400,000 people worked across thousands of organizations, universities, private industry, government laboratories, military institutions. Every component had to work. But more importantly, every system had to connect properly with every other system. Apollo was not just a technological achievement, it was a triumph of integration capacity. A civilization set a long horizon goal and then aligned institutions, expertise, and logistics around that goal. NASA has a long history of integration capacity. Another great example is when the United States landed on the surface of Mars. That mission required coordinating multiple complex systems. At the time, no civilization had ever attempted such a thing, and yet the mission succeeded because NASA had built integration capacity into it. Sarah, when complex systems must coordinate under pressure, what do you think determines whether or not integration succeeds?
So my first thought is actually a question that you may know the answer to. The units of measurement, right? The United States uses different units of measurements for, say, England or the UK. So my first thought is, especially in the example that you gave, the space example, if you are going to have cooperation and you're going to have proper integration, that you need to make sure that everyone is working with the same tools, right? The same measurements, the same understanding of the desired outcome. In many cases, let's say when you're cooking, right? If I have one of my grandmother's old English recipes, it's going to be in grams, whereas new recipes are in cups or tablespoons. And so you can't really integrate those until you convert them. And it's much the same in medicine. If you need integration or you need an understanding of, say, like a prescription, or making sure that you're taking the right supplement, what's paramount, and one of the responsibilities of your caregiver is to make sure that you have the correct information for even just taking a dose. Are you supposed to take like half a teaspoon? Are you supposed to take nobody takes a tablespoon, but for this example I'm going to say, do you take a tablespoon? But just being able to, I guess, like, relay the details in a way that are easily understood and that are measurable and attainable for the person who's working with them. I think that would be probably my first swipe at an answer to that one. Yeah, you got to make sure you're all working with the same tools and the same measurements and, the same times and the same constraints. I mean, which is probably why, going back to the space station analogy, probably why the suits didn't hook up to the spacecraft, because if one's in inches and one's in centimeters, it's not going to work.
Yes. Well, my dad, when we were growing up, he had a saying that corresponds with what you just said. He said, "Son, you got to make sure everybody's on the same sheet of music."
Yes.
My dad was very big on little sayings like that, so you can see what kind of life I had growing up. But there is another factor that allows complex systems to function: trust. Infrastructure requires trust. Medical systems require trust. Health systems require trust. Scientific research requires shared standards and understanding. Economic systems require confidence. When trust collapses, systems begin to fracture. Trust may be invisible, but it is one of the most important forms of infrastructure any civilization possesses. Sarah, I imagine trust is significant in your profession as well. How would you compare the role of trust, as in your field, to the importance of trust when multiple institutions must collaborate during a crisis?
In my mind, the first thing that I thought of was basically reputation, and how, if a person, has a good reputation, say with a patient, say, someone came to see me, or, a client, they came to our practice and they had a very good outcome. There's a strong chance that they may tell someone else, right, that they had a very good experience and recommend that practice or that person. And then, the second individual is going to come in with a level of trust or a level of understanding of the potential outcome that the first client or the first patient didn't have. And I think that's very important, whether it be a hairdresser or your doctor, or, even someone who's coming to clean your gutters. If there is that known expected outcome, I think it's much easier to achieve the desired outcome, because there is that level of trust. And when you're working on multiple systems, whether it goes back to the car analogy, right? You've someone amazing who's going to tune up your engine. You have someone fantastic who's going to rotate your tires, and you have somebody else great who's going to change your oil. You're going to take them to someone you trust, right? You're not going to take them to a Joe Bob that you've never met on the corner to take care of something that's very important to you. And some people might, but I would not. I would take my car to someone I trust. I only take my children to doctors that I have, done a deep dive, and I've checked out their credentials. I checked out their website. I've checked out their Google reviews or Facebook reviews. I've checked out, how they're rated with my insurance. And all those things are important to me. They may not be important to some other people, but the level of care that I hope for in, especially with a new practitioner, is always based on trust. And I think if you take that one step further, when you're talking about systems, you could be talking about a medical practice. You could be talking about a hospital, or a medical system. In Dallas, at the hospital, this is not an endorsement, but the hospital that I prefer is Medical City. I've had amazing experience, with their children's hospital, with their main hospital. And just as a system, I would feel very comfortable going there for any of my medical needs. Not to say that other hospitals aren't as amazing, but just I have an experience and I have a developed relationship, and I have a trust there. And to that end, if they tell me to do something, right, I trust that they are doing it for the best outcome for me or for my child. So if they tell me, great, your kid needs to take this, this breathing treatment for their asthma every 4 hours, I'm going to try to do what they tell me to do, because I trust that they're doing it for the best health outcome for my child. So if it was coming from someone I didn't trust, I probably either would get a second opinion, completely ignore it, or sadly, like many people do, go to Dr. Google and say, is this what I'm supposed to be doing? So it's important that you trust not only the individual, the person who cares for that individual system, but that you have a larger faith of the holistic treatment of any system and your anticipated outcome.
Absolutely. Sounds like you believe trust is a very big player in the way systems operate.
I
These questions become even more important when we look towards the future. Humanity is prepared to expand beyond Earth. Space exploration introduces systems of exceptional complexity, closed ecological systems, long duration missions, planetary settlements, interplanetary logistics. Technology will matter, but cooperation may matter even more because in space, trust becomes infrastructure. Shared meaning becomes survival. Sarah, from your experience when humans operate in extreme environments, whether in hospitals during a crisis or, say, future space missions, what qualities allow teams to maintain trust, adaptability, and coordination under sustained pressure?
That's a question that has many different answers. If you're considering a team, whether so for space travel, space travel, for instance, I would hope that any team if I was fortunate enough to go to space, I would hope that any team that I was traveling with would not only have the knowledge and the know-how to get us there, to make sure that the ship was working properly, to make sure that the ship was piloted properly, to make sure that there was someone who understood the systems, someone who understood life support. There would have to be trust within the team that the expertise that was needed to succeed was there. But I think also I think it goes beyond just intellect and knowledge, because I think if you are moving into extreme circumstances, and let's be honest, space is pretty extreme circumstance, there also needs to be an emotional component, and there's definitely a mental component to just being prepared for that environment, but just also being able to connect with the people who literally your life depends on. Going back to that trust, just trusting and knowing that everyone is going to do their part for the successful outcome of the mission. I would hope, unless it's Project Hail Mary, the successful return to Earth. So there's there has to be trust, but there's also, I would hope that you are, more than just crewmates, maybe even friends.
Absolutely. Well, now it's time for another quick break. So now another word for our sponsors.
This episode of The Third Horizon is also brought to you by FCA, Fine Consulting Agency. If you need high-level policy analysis, structured research, or strategic writing tailored for government, space governance, or nonprofit sectors, FCA delivers clarity, organization, and deep insight. Learn more at fcaonline.info, that is fcaonline.info.
When we study civilizations that successfully manage complexity, a pattern begins to appear. They develop three capacities: long-term thinking, reliable institutions, systems capable of learning and adapting. Here on the Third Horizon, we call that the resilience triad, because without these three capacities, complex societies eventually fracture. But when they exist, this triad exists, civilizations can navigate extraordinary challenges. The Netherlands built institutions that outlived political cycles. Trauma medicine learned from war and restructured civilian care. NASA integrated vast systems around a single mission. And even where systems failed, New Orleans, Memorial Medical Center, and Texas, the lessons are clear. Complex systems do not survive because they are strong. They survive because they adapt. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: civilizations do not fail because complexity exists. They fail when the systems or people meant to manage that complexity stop working together. Modern civilization is now entering a new phase. Knowledge itself is expanding faster than ever before. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, planetary exploration, which raises a deeper question. What happens when knowledge begins to expand faster than the wisdom guiding it? That is the question we will explore next time. This podcast is not about pointing fingers or assigning blame. This podcast is about discovering and exploring the deeper meaning behind the human experience and the systems that shape it. If you are someone who senses the world is shifting, if you feel the tension between what is and what could be, if you believe humanity is meant for something more, then welcome. This is the Third Horizon. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. And again, we want to say thank you to Dr. Sarah Clark for joining today's podcast. More conversations are coming, deeper, wider, and firmly focused on the future. And if you enjoyed today's podcast, hit the like button, let us know in the comments, and subscribe to our Spotify, YouTube, and Facebook channels, or whatever platform you are listening from. And do not forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. And until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and beyond.